In 1914, exploring the Antarctic meant sailing completely off the edge of the known world. There were no GPS satellites to track your position, no radios to call for help, and absolutely no rescue helicopters if things went wrong. This map shows the immense scale of British explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton's target, crossing the entire Antarctic continent on foot. It was a planned 2,900-kilometer trek through -50°C temperatures. But his crew of 28 men never even reached the starting line. Unusually dense pack ice in the Weddell Sea clamped around their ship, halting their momentum entirely. By October 1915, the winter froze the ocean solid. The expanding ice began to crush the wooden hull of the Endurance like a giant vice. Freezing water poured in, forcing Shackleton to give the devastating order to abandon ship. The crew watched their vessel slip beneath the surface, leaving them stranded on a floating sheet of ice in total darkness. The expedition was now completely isolated. With no ship and no way to reach their original destination, the crew's daily reality shifted to a singular, grueling focus, staying alive in an environment that offered zero food, no warmth, and no path home. The crew established what they called Ocean Camp, directly on the frozen ocean surface. They salvaged 3 small lifeboats and whatever supplies they could carry, stretching a few weeks of food among 28 hungry men. Looking at this photograph of the crew really grounds the reality of the situation. Keeping this specific group of isolated, freezing, and terrified men from turning on each other required immense psychological discipline from Shackleton. As rations disappeared, Shackleton imposed strict controls. They hunted penguins and seals, and eventually had to shoot and eat their own working animals, the sled dogs pictured here, to avoid starvation. Then, in April 1916, their temporary sanctuary began to break apart. Warmer currents caused the ice floe beneath their tents to crack, splinter, and shrink to a fraction of its original size. Shackleton ordered the men to abandon the crumbling ice. They dragged their 3 salvaged lifeboats into the freezing waters and began to row. Passive survival was no longer an option. They had to leave their only solid ground and jump directly into the unpredictable swells of the Antarctic Ocean. 7 days later, they hit land, Elephant Island, but the relief evaporated almost immediately. The island was a barren rock, entirely uninhabited and far removed from any commercial shipping lanes. Remaining there meant certain starvation. To get help, Shackleton took 5 men and a single reinforced rowboat to attempt a 1,300-kilometer crossing to the South Georgia Island whaling station. To survive, this meant navigating the Drake Passage, notorious for being the deadliest stretch of water on the planet. For over 2 weeks, the 6 men constantly bailed water to prevent sinking, fighting off seasickness and frostbite while riding 12-meter-high hurricane waves. By sheer force of will, they survived the crossing and hit solid ground. But their boat was ruined, and they had landed on the uninhabited southern coast of South Georgia Island, miles from the whaling station. Between them and rescue was a 10,000-foot-high, unmapped range of jagged glaciers. Roped together without tents or sleeping bags, Shackleton and 2 men hiked for 36 hours straight, physically carving steps into the ice with an axe. Shackleton's leadership was defined by a refusal to accept a dead end. Every time the environment presented a fatal obstacle, he calculated an immediate physical response, forcing his body and mind past the point of exhaustion to execute the next rescue phase. When Shackleton finally stumbled into the Stromness whaling station, the workers couldn't believe their eyes. They were looking at a man presumed dead for nearly 2 years, who was now demanding a rescue ship. Meanwhile, the 22 men left behind on Elephant Island survived by huddling under overturned boats for 128 days. Shackleton mounted 3 separate rescue missions that were repeatedly blocked by dense ice before finally breaking through on a Chilean tugboat. As the ship approached the rocky shore, they counted the figures waving back at them. Against staggering mathematical odds, all 28 men survived the expedition. The crew returned to civilization, but the vessel that brought them to the ice remained lost in the crushing depths of the Weddell Sea for over a century. In 2022, underwater investigators located the wreck of the Endurance, resting 10,000 feet below the surface. The freezing, oxygen-deprived waters kept the woodwork remarkably preserved. The Endurance expedition stands today as a profound anomaly in the history of exploration. 28 men went in, and 28 men came out. This total survival was the result of a chain of impossible physical feats, rowing through hurricane-force waves and traversing unmapped peaks with little more than a rope and an axe.